All right, so I figure we can start by loading the filaments, which this might be slightly awkward at this angle, but we'll figure it out. And you've got them labeled over here, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we're gonna load filament 1.
Let me get a better angle.
Yeah.
Okay, so from here, sorry to my viewers, I'm being blurry right now. There we go. Okay.
Okay. And so you feed it through, and this does get a little tricky because you kind of got to give it a little bit of extra room so that you can work with it. And it's going to come out the back, so a lot of times when you push it in, it's going to kind of, pop out one of the other sides, but you can just kind of push it into the buffer until it pops out into one of the corners, and just kind of keep working it around until you get it kind of in the front here. And this is a little bit of a tricky move.
So you just kind of shoved it through and kept pushing until it came out to the other side.
So it comes up to the other side
somewhere.
Yeah,
okay.
and sometimes it'll pop out on the other side, and you've got to kind of just kind of got to work with it till you can get it to pop out on this side. That's one of the reasons that this buffer is such a pain to use, because loading it is a little bit difficult. So then you just have to kind of get it in the tube without bending the filament as much as you can, because if it's bent, then it has a tougher time getting through the tube. There we go. Okay, so once it's in there, and this again is a pain, we'll feed it through a little bit, and then let me grab the wrench, and I'm gonna loosen the screw on this outlet here a little bit, and we're gonna pull the PTFE tube out. And this is just to make things a little bit easier. Let's start with the tube out. Yeah, so once you fed it through here, you put the filament through the hole and then feed it into this tube. And then you can just feed it into there. Oh, it's all the way up there, that's why it won't go anymore. So yeah, so you just do that and you can watch the filament go up the tube to the MMU unit, and you'll see it go in right there, and then eventually you'll feel it kind of stop, like you can't push it easily anymore. And you can look inside here. It's very difficult to see. We might not be able to see it. Sometimes you can see if the filament has entered the chamber where the gears are, and it's sitting right on top of the gear. That's where you want it to be, but when it stops moving, that's probably about where it is. So once you've got the filament all the way up to the MMU, we're going to reattach our PTFE tube here. Put it back in there, and you don't want it to stick through the other side very far. It's okay if it pokes out just a little bit on the other side, but you just want to make sure you don't stuff it several inches in there, so you don't have a lot of tube inside the buffer.
So the tube does go through most of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. it can go all the way through, but you just want it to go right to the other edge, and then you can tighten the screw so that it stays in place. And just a few turns should do it, yeah. And if it's okay if it's not perfectly tight. You don't want to over tighten it because you can kink the tube. Just tight enough so that it doesn't pop right out. And so we'll do that again with filament number 2 here. And this is okay, but you want to make sure, if you have a bent filament, it can have a tough time going through the PTFE tube. So as long as it's relatively straight, that's good enough.
Sorry, I'm making a mess.
And you're good. And this tip looks perfectly fine, actually. That's actually a good tip. I don't know that I can do a better one. As long as it's not all kind of globbed up and bad, it's okay. But the PTFE tubes they are just barely wider than the filament. So if you have a big glob or something somewhere, it's not gonna go through. So we will load the second filament here. And again, we will just push it into the buffer until we see it. It'll pop out one of the corners. Okay, it popped out kind of this back corner this time. So I just kind of feed a little bit extra.
Is there a good and a bad place for it to pop out?
No, it's
just comes out anywhere?
Yeah, sometimes it comes out. It depends how it comes out of the spool, which direction it wants to bend, you know what I mean? So it can be a little bit random. And so once it kind of, if you give it a little bit extra, then you have some kind of extra filament to move around. So once I get it over there, it's got to be over in this corner. So I kind of just push that over like that, and then
Does it always have to come out there where your hands are right now?
Yes, so it has to come out because
to where the number is.
Yeah, so filament number 2, it's going to come out on this side. If we were going to add 3 more filaments, they would come out on this side, and these tubes would hook up over there.
Okay.
Let's see if I can get this in here. It's always a little bit of a pain. Let's see if I can. There we go. Okay. And we will take the second PTFE tube.
Is it labeled up here too?
It is not, but it goes from right to left. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay.
So this is number 2. And from the front, it's, left to right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so. And we will feed the filament through until it gets, now look, I did it wrong. I chose filament number 3's PTFE. So let's do that again. Let's get, no, that's number, no, it's not. There we go. This is number 2.
We can come up with a color coding sticker scheme.
And you can see too, once you can see it's getting a little bit rough on the end from being in and out of there. You can buy this PTFE tubing for very, very cheap and, replace it every once in a while just to keep things fresh and smooth. Okay.
Is that available on Amazon, or do you have to get it through Prusa?
No, you can get that on Amazon. It's like industry standard tubing. So it's it's one of those things, like if you know the specifications and the diameters, you can get it pretty much anywhere.
Okay.
I tend to follow the suggestions of people on the forums. They will give you links and say like, hey, I've used this one and we like it. So that's where I figure out where to get things from. Okay, so we have 2 filaments loaded. I guess it's time to fire this thing up. And when it turns on, it will make a few sounds, and those sounds are okay. That clicking sound is, it's the, what is that part called? The pulley idler. It's just, the motor is just figuring out where it starts and ends. Just kind of doing a little self-calibration. This will do one when we start printing. You'll see it, go back and forth to either side just to make sure that it's got its bearings.
So that's an okay noise?
Yes, that is an okay noise. That is its...
When we first heard that, we all panicked.
Yep, that's... It's a little concerning, but that happens every time you turn it on. It's just the thing in there making sure that it knows its orientation and everything. And yeah, if it starts up successfully, the first light will be green, which means we're ready to go. And those lights are used, if you have a problem with a certain filament, that light will blink during printing. It'll be pretty obvious which filament's the problem because you're currently printing with it, but there are many, many different light codes. I do not have them memorized. I usually have to have the handbook next to me to look, say like, okay, what does a red light then a green light mean? So that's a very handy thing to have with you while you're doing this. So okay, I've got this card in here. I have some test prints, which these can be found on Prusa's website. There are these test prints that take 25 minutes that will test 2 to 5 filaments. So we can do a quick 2 filament 25-minute test, and that's just to make sure that the filaments can unload and load correctly. It's not a glamorous print by any means. It's just a means to, it's a quick print that will get you changing. Because I'd love to print a benchy, but in the 2-color benchy, you don't switch filaments until you're up at where the trim on the edge of the boat is. So you got to wait about half an hour before you change a filament. So we have this 2-color 12 change print. Obviously everything needs to heat up here.
So unlike when you're doing single extruder Prusa, you don't have to load the filament as a step, manually load it yourself.
Correct.
And then load up the SD card.
Yes, this will load and unload all the filaments automatically, and that's where you run into most problems, because what can happen is, when it's rewinding a filament, a lot of times it can get when it comes out of the extruder, that's not in there all the way, that's okay though. When the filament comes out of the extruder, it's gonna have a little bit of a blob on the end, just like if you were to pull it out. And you want it to be, you want the tip to be pointed, and the way that they've got this thing set up, it pulls it out in such a fashion that it gets a nice little tip on it. But sometimes if that blob is just too big, it'll get caught in this tube, and then this thing is trying to rewind it, and it ends up grinding the filament. So you grind away some of the filament, and it can no longer grab onto it to move it. So now you're stuck with filament here, and you've got a problem that you have to fix, and it's easily fixable by just unscrewing this Festo connector right here. And we'll see when this is printing. We'll get a better picture of this. You just kind of unscrew this, and you'll have to pull pretty hard, but you'll be able to pull the filament out and you clip it, and you just put it back in, and it'll go on your way. But that's why I recommend upgrading this, because we can get one that has a just slightly bigger diameter. So if you have a piece of filament that's, yes, it's more forgiving. Because that is, when I had this thing running smoothly, that was the only problems I was having, was every once in a while, I think I printed a benchy, and I think it happened 3 times, which really isn't bad for an 8-hour print, and it's swapping filaments, 2 times a layer for however many layers, that's, hundreds of filament switches. So for that to only happen, 3 out of how many hundreds of times, that's not a horrible failure rate. But again, getting the wider tube will probably fix that problem right up.
Okay.
It should do its bed leveling here. And in a minute here, we're probably going to hear the sound that I was just telling you about. I think there's a small piece of filament caught in the Bondtech extruder gear. And it's just making a sound. It's not, I don't think it's hurting anything, but it's more annoying than anything. But we're
going to have to rip everything apart to get it out?
Possibly, unfortunately.
That noise?
That's good. Yep, that's okay. So what it's doing is, and you'll see this, it'll do this at the beginning of the print, and actually this needs to be centered. It just kind of goes back and forth to make sure it knows where the sides are and knows that it's aligned. So that's normal. And
red light.
So what it is doing now is it should be trying to load the filament. It's kind of hard to see in there, and it's not loading. So what we need to do is you can just push we're trying to load the first filament, it's the blue one. Just push it in a little bit, and you'll eventually feel it grab once we should. Might not be grabbing. Let's see what it's doing in there. Oh, it's not. Okay, so it's in its error state. It's saying, okay, it failed to load. We want it to keep trying. The button on the right is the continue print button. Now, sometimes this doesn't always work. Again, I usually have to have a handbook here. Okay, so it's attempting to load again, because you can see the screws. Okay, and you can see here, see this little ball right in there? You can see when it goes up and down. That's how it detects when the filament gets to that spot. Oh no.
It's coming through.
Yeah, well, it's stuck.
Oh.
I'm unsure why. And see, this is what I was talking about. If it gets stuck, that gear in there is trying to drive it, and it's not going anywhere. So it's very likely stripping that filament. Now, I don't know why it won't go through. Again, like if this tube was, I think that's where it's getting caught, is in that tube. Oh, did have this thing working. We're gonna have to wait for it to give up trying here, which should happen in a moment. And once it does, we'll take this out and we'll clip it, and we'll try it again.
I'm glad that we're having these errors.
Yeah,
that's because
this is the most common thing that happens.
Yeah.
And again, that's why I'm saying, like, if we just replace this tube, I really think that that's going to help a lot of these problems. Because the resistance isn't, I've tested out everything, from behind the gears down to here. All of that's good. All of that moves freely. And now it's trying to rewind it. We're going to help it a little bit by tugging on it here. Well, okay. It wasn't able to rewind it. It's still trying to rewind. We're going to give it a moment to give up here. Yeah, and you can see the gears on the inside. They are moving backwards. A neat mod you can do is you can print these little, I don't know what you'd call them, but you can glue a magnet to this part of the motor, and then it's something on the outside so you can see if this motor is moving or not without having to like peek in there. And you can do it on the extruder motor as well. So people print like cool little like windmills or, you know, cool little designs. You can make one that said HHS that, you know, spins or whatever.
So cool.
Oh, this is trying for a long time, maybe because it's the initial load. Normally I don't recommend this, but it's not going to hurt anything. It's still trying to rewind it. Oh, we have a much bigger problem. Interesting. Yeah, this is a good thing to know. Sometimes when it's not feeding up here, it's actually not a clogging problem. It is the tension of this top door. The tension of this top door is very, very, very important. It cannot be too loose or too tight. Usually you want the screws to be about 0.1 millimeter below the surface. And we've got them about there right now, but we saw, you know, it's trying to feed this filament in and it's not able to. And the reason is because the idler door is not tight enough, which I don't know why it's not tight enough right now, but, and I was able to tell that just by pressing down on it a little bit. Like you'll see that when it feeds the filament in, the idler door actually moves up from the rest of the unit a tiny bit because there's these springs in there. That's by design. So you can see it's got a hold of it now, but this needed to be a tiny bit tighter. I don't recommend tightening more than a turn or two at each time. Right now it's kind of in its I've failed mode and I'm trying very hard to get the filament there. And it's gonna get there. It's gonna succeed. And when it gets there, you'll see this door on the side slightly pop out, and that's how it knows that the filament has gotten to the extruder. Is when that door clicks out a tiny bit. Yeah. And so what happens is when it reaches that point, this motor takes over and this motor stops driving everything. So that's what that filament sensor does, is it tells this, it's like, hey, I've got the filament now, we're good to go. And it'll start printing.
Do you know, does it tell you here when it's going to, how many minutes until it switches?
It does not tell you when the next switch is. If you have your slicer open, you can take a look at that. And if you use something like Octoprint, I bet that it would. I've not used Octoprint with multi-material, but Octoprint gives you all sorts of other cool information on what's happening.
That installed on that computer. Yeah.
It's very neat.
It's good.
Love it.
Is Octoprint a slicer?
Octoprint is what? I don't even know what you'd call it. It's a piece of software that it drives the printer. So like it talks to the printer over USB. So instead of printing from an SD card, the computer is giving the instructions to the printer. But it, you know, runs in a web interface. So you have all these tools and plugins and all these neat things that you could do. It's basically just a really glorified way to, you know, print things. But you can do great things. Like if you set up a camera, it can handle like the monitoring. It knows how to do time-lapse stuff in the sense that it'll wait till the bed gets to a certain point before taking the picture. So when you do your time lapse, it's not moving all over. Like, so there are just so many things Octoprint can do. It's very cool. Okay, so it rewound the other filament. And now it is going to load the orange filament.
No.
Yep.
That's magic.
Mm-hmm. Well.
If it works.
It's very fragile magic.
So yeah, it's rewound the blue and it's grabbed orange.
Yeah, and so what it'll do now is it's going to feed it in there, and this is the wipe tower over here, so it's just purging the last filament a little bit. So that, because you'll see when it, you know, starts coming out, it's still going to be blue from last time, and eventually it'll, you know, turn into its orange.
It just knows when it's turned to orange. Because I know on the original one, it keeps asking me, and I have to tell it.
Yep. Yeah, this does it all automatically. Because there, you know, depending on what you're printing, there will be hundreds and hundreds of filament changes because you're printing multiple colors on every layer. So, you know, it definitely takes even longer than normal 3D printing.
This over there is just where it does all its spitting.
Yep. That just goes in the trash, unfortunately.
Yep.
Unless you reclaim your PLA.
Explain what's just happened.
So what just happened is it tried to reload this orange filament, and there was a tiny bit of debris left over from the blue filament that just swapped out. And so what's happened is it's gotten stuck in this tube here. So it's still trying to push the filament through. And what's going to happen is because the gear is spinning under the filament, it's going to eat away at that filament, and it's not going to be able to grab it to push it anymore. So once this gives up trying, we're going to remove the filament and kind of reset things and send it on its way here. But we need to wait just a moment for it to give up. There might be a button or a button combination to tell it to give up. I do not know what it is or if it exists. We would have to look that up. Okay, so
We got a red light.
yeah, it gave up trying to push through. Now it's going to try to rewind it, which is also not going to work, and it's just going to further grind away at that filament, but it'll give up here in a minute. Okay, so the blinking light means that it has given up, and it's stuck on the second filament. So we'll remove this Festo connector. You'll see as you pull it, you'll notice too, like it doesn't want to come out of the tube. It's really stuck in there. So you will have to kind of apply some force, and that will kind of make it pretty obvious as to why it was stuck. And yeah, you can see the blue debris that came out there with it. And we probably don't need to retrim this. This tip isn't too bad, but we'll just, for good measure. Actually, no, what we need to do, as I was telling you, as it was grinding away on the filament down here, we'll pull it through.
Yeah,
you can see it. So because of this, every time that goes over the gear, it's not going to be able to grip it and push it through. So yeah, I recommend pulling it out. And yeah, snip it just somewhere. And then you can't, oh, no, we have another place where it was. Let's pull it out a little further. And then we will replace the Festo connector.
And it only has to be protruding into there a little bit.
It'll figure itself out, because what it's going to try to do is rewind it. And since this sensor here, it knows when it's rewound because this sensor will tell it. So it could be all the way down here or all the way up here. It doesn't care. It'll figure itself out. And we will press the third button to resume the print. So now it's going to try to rewind it. It just rewound it, and there's a little ball right here. So you can see the ball is kind of below the circle right now, and you just saw it move up. That means the filament went underneath it. Okay, there we go. So now it'll resume. And sometimes this gets a little bit deeper, but we saw previously with the blue filament, when it rewound, it almost looked like there was a bit of stringiness on the end, and that's what got left over in the tube and what clogged up the orange filament. And what you can do is, a lot of times it has to do with the temperature of the extruder. If it's stringy, it means it was too hot. If it comes out too bulbous, it means it was too cold. It needs to be a little bit warmer.
You too, thank you.
So that's what we saw happening there. Oh, and okay, so right now, because it was in a failed state for long enough, it turned the nozzle heat off, so it's just preheating again. That's all it's doing now.
Yeah. Safety. It looks like it's gonna work its magic again.
Yep, there it goes.
Is the positioning of these spools important?
Yes, it is very important.
So tell me why
when there's only two,
Yeah.
we're okay. I mean, really, you want the filament to just run in a straight path to it. Now, this is actually not set up too well, but it's working for us. When you normally have 5 spools, you set it up so that you have 3 in the front and then 2 in the back. So you would have, spool 1 would be here, spool 2 would be back here, spool 3 would be here, 4 and 5. And if you look on Prusa's website, they tell you exactly how to set all that up, the preferred arrangement. You might have to mess with it, finick with it a little bit. As long as it works, it's okay. As long as the filament kind of goes straight into the PTFE tube, you're good to go.